Yes, sir, Sam. Thanks for joining us, everybody. I think we're going to have an exciting, fun-filled couple of hours, and I think you're going to get a lot of information that's going to be very helpful when you are dealing with people whose point of origin is outside the United States. They may be resident aliens, they may be non-resident aliens by the time that you meet them, but they are going to require a little special attention from your institution. As Sam said, I'm going to take care of the identifying number issues, and Mary Beth is going to take care of the identification issues. Now, no question about it, Mary Beth's got the toughest part of the job in this context. Mine is pretty objective and pretty straightforward. As long as you understand the rules and follow the rules, you're going to know what it is you have to do in connection with obtaining the correct identification number. What we've got here is an issue that involves several sources of law. It's about the Bank Secrecy Act. It's about the Internal Revenue Service. It involves identification, and it involves various identifying numbers, different types of numbers from different countries, and so forth. And what we're going to try to do is to combine those issues. But let me just say what the focal point is. We are talking about opening deposit accounts for people who were born outside the United States, and we're talking about opening those accounts with United States financial institutions. And we're going to try to keep that conversation that narrow, because if we start going off down tangential paths that are readily available to us, we're not going to have time to address the things that we promised that we would address. Specifically, some things that we're not going to talk about is issues regarding lending, portfolio interest, or reporting for entities. Again, we are focusing on individuals. We are not going to talk about FATCA, which essentially deals with non-U.S. financial institutions dealing with U.S. persons. So there's a pretty dramatic distinction between the requirements that we're addressing and those that are addressed in the FATCA legislation. So let's just start out with the people that we need to be interested in terms of identifying numbers. Let's begin there on page 4 in your materials. We are talking about people who are generally not U.S. citizens, but we also have to put everything in context. Our initial issue is the customer identification program requirements of the Bank Secrecy Act. It basically says, among three other things, what you have to have is an identifying number. And it makes a distinction between residents and non-residents, and specifically it focuses on U.S. citizens. So there on page 4, I just want to go through some common questions. And by the way, I will use the slides in the presentation, but they're primarily mile markers. There is no information on any of the slides that is not better explained in the materials that you have in front of you. So I will talk about the materials for the most part. The slides are just sort of to keep us in the neighborhood, so to speak. So the Q's and A's, they're on page 4. It's already underlined. It's already in boldface that those Q's and A's are provided by me. They are not from any official resource like the Internal Revenue Service or FinCEN. These are just my answers to the questions that we get very, very routinely. In terms of aliens, non-U.S. citizens, there are a couple different types. There are resident aliens, there are non-resident aliens, and frankly, we're going to treat them a little bit differently when they open an account with our institution. Is your institution required to verify a customer's citizenship? Not really. In Mary Beth's presentation, she's certainly going to talk to you about identification and different types of identification. But what you're trying to determine there is the person's identity, not really their citizenship. And if you know that somebody is not a U.S. citizen, are you required to determine if they're in the United States legally? No, that's simply not your job. There are some major institutions that actually solicit business from people whom they know quite well are not in the United States legally. So you're entitled to put together whatever sort of restrictions that you might want to have, however. If you wanted to build it into your CIP, that part of identification was verifying that the person is in the United States legally, you could attempt to do that. There'd be a couple challenges for you, but it is not something that you are required to do, and it probably would add to somewhat the complexity of your program. Go on to page 5, if you would. So here's the excerpt from the CIP regulation with the Bank Secrecy Act. It does mention in the whole regulation that you get the name, the address, the date of birth, but we're really only interested in the identifying number today. So take a look at the second italicized paragraph there at the top of page 5. It says very clearly, if it's a U.S. person, then we need a taxpayer identification number. Make a note there. They're talking about a U.S. taxpayer identification number. On the other hand, if it's a non-U.S. person, we could accept a U.S. taxpayer identification number, a passport number and country of issuance, an alien card number, or some other number that was on some form of government-issued identification from that other country. Probably a good thing to realize right now, there's a lot more flexibility for non-U.S. persons than there is for U.S. persons. If you're a U.S. person, such as an Amish person, there is only one acceptable number, and that is a U.S. taxpayer identification number. And I use that particular example because the Amish have a religious objection to participating in the Social Security system, and oftentimes, historically, they have not had U.S.-issued taxpayer identification numbers. So the irony is we would have some flexibility if the person just got off the boat or the plane from a foreign country. But for somebody whose family had lived in the United States for generations, no. There is only one number that is acceptable, and that is a U.S. taxpayer identification number. I want to mention there at the bottom of page 5, the CIP regulation gives you some flexibility when the person has applied for a U.S. taxpayer identification number. In other words, I don't have one, but I have applied for it. What the CIP regulation says is that you could put a paragraph into your CIP where you obtain evidence that this person has applied for a number. And you could go ahead and you could open the account based on the fact that they had an application pending. Now, first and foremost, that is available to you if you put it in your CIP. In other words, you have to say, here's what we're going to do and here's how we are going to do it. But I would encourage you that there's the top of page 6. This exception may create more problems for you than it's worth. I think the banks that initially put it into their CIP back in 2003, they had it in mind that if somebody had just moved to the United States from a foreign country and they didn't have a U.S. number yet, this would allow them to go ahead and open the account. I'll point out to you that if they had just moved to the United States and didn't have a U.S. number yet, they still had a passport that was issued by their country of origin. And we could have used the passport number according to the CIP regulation. And if they'd later been awarded the U.S. taxpayer identification number, they could have brought that number in and provided us with it. So I think people were excited about the exception, and they put it into their CIP. And then later, in the fullness of time, they sort of said, why did we do that? You know, what would be the real value of allowing this person to open an account and saying that we would have to go back later and attempt to extract some usable number for them? We could have just taken their number from, again, their country of origin. There in the middle of page 6, it talks about what is a U.S. person. No real surprise to a banker, but there's two definitions for a U.S. person. One comes from the Bank Secrecy Act, or the CIP regulation more specifically, and the other comes from the Internal Revenue Service. We're going to deal with both issues today. I don't think this discrepancy between the definitions is going to cause us a problem, but I do want to point out that it exists. As far as the CIP regulation is concerned, a U.S. citizen, is the only U.S. person. In other words, to be a U.S. person, as that term is used in the Bank Secrecy Act and its regulations, that means you're a citizen. The Internal Revenue Service, however, a little more liberal on this particular point. And the IRS calls somebody a U.S. person. That means they are either a U.S. citizen or, as you see in the second column in the information map on page 6, they are a resident alien. For tax purposes, a U.S. person includes a resident alien. For CIP purposes,